here today. Thank you for inviting me to present my work. Thank you. So today I'm going to present a paper that is joint work with Katrin Gasior, who is a former PhD student of mine and the lead author of this paper, and Daria Popova, with whom I've done several collaborations in the past. So just to give you a little bit of a background to this piece of work, it's part of a more extended research agenda that I've started with Daria some years ago, 2018 or something like that, where we were interested in constructing this concept of individual income in order to use it to examine income inequality from a gender perspective. Yeah, and we have tried to do this by using microdata, generally household surveys, in conjunction with microsimulation models. I mean, I can say a bit more about this, but for those of you who are not familiar, microsimulation models are essentially a way to reconstruct quite accurately tax liabilities and benefit entitlements based on legislation and using information from microdata. Yeah, so you take the microdata, you observe the characteristics of the individuals and households there, and then you apply to, the rules of the tax benefit system to estimate tax liabilities and benefit entitlements, and these help to then construct income concepts. So the whole idea here is not new, but what we wanted to focus on is this individual perspective, because we were really interested in trying to account in some way for intra-household inequality. Right, so typically studies of poverty or inequality assume, you know, the way that these measures are constructed, they assume no intra-household inequality. Yeah, so all the incomes are completely pooled and shared equally. So two people living in the same household will have the same standard of living, the same poverty risk, yeah, and so on. And we wanted to try and find a way to go beyond this approach, yeah, and we'll see today if I convince you that we've succeeded at least to some extent, and look at inequality and poverty, but you know, taking an individual perspective, and then also trying to understand various drivers of these inequality and poverty indicators, including policies. Yeah, in most of our papers, we have we take a cross-national perspective, though not so much in this one. So the paper that started all of this is now published in Social Science Research. It came out a few years ago, and in that paper we look at inequality at the whole population. Right, so we try and look at how income inequality between men and women. First to measure it, and then also to establish to what extent the tax benefit system contributes or mitigates the inequality generated by the market. Then in some subsequent work that was published in a chapter coming out at the beginning of this year, we try and improve a little bit on that methodology. And we kind of try and use information about income pooling and income sharing from an ad hoc module of SILC, from the 2010 module of SILC, to try and improve that methodology a little bit. And then other things that we have done, so we have assessed the gender implications of COVID-19 related measures for reports sponsored by the European Institute for Gender Equality and the Swedish presidency from a year ago. And then I'm gonna talk about today's paper that looks at poverty. Okay, so in this paper, what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus more on the bottom of the distribution, right? We wanted to look more at the risk of poverty in the working age population. Yeah, the entire paper focuses solely on the working age population. Yeah, so we don't have anything to say about older people here. And the idea is to try and see, which not only to look at how much poverty risks between men and women vary when you take an individual perspective, but also, which characteristics are more likely to, which characteristics are linked to a higher poverty risk. And finally, to try and look at the role of the taxes and benefits, the tax benefit system, and to see the extent to which taxes and benefits mitigate or accentuate inequalities that we observe that are generated in the market. So in this paper, we use the entire EU. So we use all the countries all the countries that are in EU Silk 2019. I should be more precise, plus the UK. Yeah, so we have a bunch of countries in there. And what motivated us really was, so we started with these debates that were very popular in the noughties and also perhaps afterwards in the 2010s, where, if you remember, the answer to solving poverty was employment, right? So if you remember the Lisbon strategy and all that discourse during that period, the idea was, well, we can try and solve more or less poverty if we get enough people into employment. Yeah. And there were two sides to these policies, which I would say is the carrot and the stick, right? On the one hand, you would try and encourage and support people's employment. And on the other hand, there was the threat or the actual withdrawal of support outside of it, right? And this model of full-time continuous employment, we argued, was sort of gender blind in some sense. So there were no specific provisions for men and women. It was supposed to apply equally to both. And it's what we called here, and what is called in the literature, the adult worker model. Yeah, so essentially, we want full-time continuous employment for all adults as much as possible. Now, 15 or 20 years after these policies were implemented and were quite popular, what we have seen is that employment did increase. And in some cases, for some groups, for example, single mothers who usually had lower participation rates, it increased quite substantially, quite impressively, in many cases. But these increases in employment have not necessarily been translated into a reduction in poverty, and at least not to the extent that we would have expected based on the theory. What we have seen is that in-work poverty increased in many cases, and also that women continue to face higher poverty risks compared to men. Okay, so we argue that the problem with this approach is that this activation framework really has this ideal in mind of continuous, stable, and very importantly, decently paid employment. And obviously not all employment satisfies these conditions, and it's also harder for some groups to perhaps attain this ideal compared to others. Yeah, so women still continue to do a larger share of the unpaid domestic work. We know that that has consequences for their labor market outcomes, both in terms of participation, perhaps less in terms of participation these days, but there are consequences in terms of hours. Yeah, women work, massively more likely to work part-time or not to work full-time. And also in terms of earnings. Yeah, so even among full-time women, we still observe a gender pay gap. So what we wanted to do here is we wanted to sort of take stock and think, okay, to what extent do to what extent women fit this model here of the adult worker model on the one hand. Two, if they don't fit, what are exactly the labor market characteristics that prevent them or that expose them more to poverty? What are the labor market characteristics that are most associated with being in poverty? And finally, we wanted to again look at the role of taxes and benefits, right, and how they work. So this, I've already mentioned some of these ideas on the slide. So if you want to think about activation and gender and how women might, fit, whether they, it might be good for them or might be bad for them, or how, and when I say good or bad, obviously we take this poverty perspective here. So as I said, you might think that, public provision or subsidies for childcare that were part of these activation programs might be beneficial for women because, there is quite big literature that says these types of policies increase participation and also potentially decrease pay penalties for motherhood. On the other hand, there was also some reduction of direct income support, which might be less beneficial for women because we know from the literature that generous income support tends to reduce the gender poverty gap. Finally, the last element with in-work benefits. I haven't seen that many studies that include specifically a gender dimension, and I think it's important to think of the design, right? So it might be that in some countries, women were disproportionately likely to receive this kind of benefits, but in some countries, maybe less so. Okay, so just to take a step back, what we're trying to do here, we're trying to look at the poverty risk of women, and various categories of women, and we want to do that using an individual income concept. And the reason why we want to use, so again, taking a step back, like the previous literature uses this unitary Beckerian approach where you construct, you assume complete pooling and equal sharing among all individuals in a household. And that's the approach that's taken. We argue, though, that this is not ideal for two reasons. First, we know that this idea of complete pooling and equal sharing is now supported by empirical studies, right? So there is pooling, but rarely is it complete, and there is sharing, but rarely is it completely equal, right? There's another reason that we want to use an individual income concept, and that is that this unitary approach is very impractical if you want to study gender income inequality, because men and women in household by definition are equal, right? So you cannot really study intra-household inequality. All the measures are driven by differences between a single adult households, right? With different where the head is of different genders. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to switch to an individual concept of income based on minimum income pooling. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we construct it in a minute, but I think this concept of minimum income pooling is important to stop for a moment and think about it. So in some sense, we go to the other extreme, all right? So on the one hand, you assume, full sharing, full pooling. We go to the other extreme and we'll say, well, what if there is no sharing, right? And in some sense, you might say, well, but households do pool their income, right? And we agree, right? It's not, we don't want to argue that, okay, there is no income pooling, or, it doesn't matter whether your spouse is very rich or very poor, right? Obviously it matters. And in this sense, our measure does not capture consumption, if you like, right? But at the same time, we argue that it is an important measure of, for example, economic independence. Yeah, and it's also an important measure of bargaining power. So we know from the literature that the share of earnings or the share of income is correlated quite highly with consumption, for example, and with other indicators of well-being. So in that sense, we argue it's an important indicator. Another interpretation that you could take is that if the unitary approach gives you a sort of lower bound of poverty, our approach gives you a sort of upper bound. Yeah, and so in between these two is probably where the actual poverty lies. Okay. So what do? We use USILC 2019 and the 2019-2020 FRS together with EUROMOD and UKMOD. EUROMOD and UKMOD are these microsimulation models that I've mentioned in the beginning. And you might ask, okay, so why not use directly information from the data? Why bother with microsimulation? Well, there are a few advantages, we argue. First, it's very rare that you have good information on taxes and social insurance contributions straight from survey data. Most people don't know how much tax they pay, right? Unless they look at their pay slip, they don't really know how much tax and how much social insurance contribution they pay, but we are able to kind of recreate these measures using microsimulation. Microsimulation is also useful when you want to individualize incomes that are collected at the household level. So this is a particular problem with SILC, I would say, less with the FRS. But with SILC, what happens is that you collect, say, a number of information about a number of benefits, say child benefits, maternity pay, means tested child's educational grants or things like that. And then what SILC does, it aggregates all these things at the household level, right? Which is not ideal. So what we want is we want to, disaggregate back down to the individual level, and the microsimulation model allows us to do that. Then what we can also do, we can come up with more accurate measures of the benefit unit. I think this already is provided in FRS, for example, to some extent, but in SILC, you only observe the individual and the household. You don't really observe any intermediary units in between. Yeah, and we are able to reconstruct those using microsimulation. As I said before, we focus on the working age population solely, and here actually it's this prime age population 25 to 55. And we do that because essentially we don't really want to bother with country differences in early retirement and country differences in the age at which you leave school. So kind of make our life easy. We just focus on this restricted range. Okay, so how do we build this income measure? So what we do is we start with individual sources of income, right? So things like earnings, like pensions, benefits that are received in an individual capacity, for example, contributory benefits of various sorts, right? And so we attribute these things to the individual who receives them. Then we attribute social insurance and individual taxes to the individual that is liable. For joint personal income tax, which we do have a few cases in our data, what we do is we split the tax liability in proportion to taxable income. One could argue that other things could be done, but we just wanted to keep it simple. And then finally, we have these common sources of income that you can't easily individualize, right? So for example, family benefits, social assistance, where, you know, these benefits are not targeted at an individual, but at a group of individuals, right? So what we do here, because we don't know exactly how these benefits are spent, right? We don't have information on that. So what we do is we try various assumptions. Yeah, so in our main scenario, we just split these benefits equally among the entitled adults. Yeah, and this could be not the entire household. So say if you have an extended household where you have parents with children and an older generation, we would split the child benefit only among the parents, right, and not the whole household. Okay, so that's the simple scenario, and then we try and see, well, does this really matter? What does make a difference? So we have two extra scenarios where we assign all these benefits to the primary earner, which is the person with the highest market income in the household, and another scenario where we assign all these benefits to the secondary earner, which is the partner of the primary earner or the person with the second highest market income. So our main scenario is kind of in between with these two, right? So these are kind of trying to see how much this matters. And finally, to be able to compare households of different size, we kind of adapt the standard modified OECD scale to work with individual incomes. Okay, so then we, having constructed this measure of individual income, what we want to do is we want to look at poverty, and we do that in a slightly unusual way. So first, to say that the poverty line is fixed and is calculated in the standard way, right? So it doesn't really, it's not really influenced by our, by our income split. We just recalculate everything the standard way, and we just fix the poverty line. But then we not only compare the poverty rates of men and women, but we introduce this concept of reference worker. So what is the reference worker? Well, it's the worker that sort of satisfies or comes very close to satisfying this adult worker ideal, right? So it's a person that works full-time, that's 35 plus hours, that's in continuous employment throughout the 12 months, and who has been working at least 2/3 of their adult life, right? So it's a person with a very strong attachment to employment and in full-time employment. And obviously you have male reference workers and female reference workers, that is, those who satisfy these conditions. And what we do is we will compare the poverty risk of various groups of women to those of the male reference worker group, right? To see how, to see not just, okay, what's the poverty risk, but what's the poverty risk, in comparison to this group that, in theory satisfies this, adult worker model ideal. Okay, and then we do two more things. We look at the role of labor market characteristics by doing some logit regressions, where we examine the role of economic status, working hours, skill level, and work experience while controlling for a bunch of demographics. And finally, we look at the impact of taxes and benefits. Again, like in both cases, both here and in the next analysis, we look in reference to this group, right? These male reference workers. Okay, so let me show you some results. So when we look at the sample and we see, to what extent men and women fit these models, this, full-time, stable, continuous employment model, we see that about 1/3 of the women fit this model compared to about 2/3 of the men in our whole EU-UK sample. Yeah, and perhaps, it's not unexpected, but you can see the difference is still quite sizable. Yeah, and women are more likely to be inactive, but also more likely to work part-time and more likely to have disrupted careers. We find the usual patterns that partnership and parenthood have the opposite effects, right? So a partnered man with children are more likely to be, to fit in this category of reference workers, whereas the opposite is true for women. All right, and we also find that female reference workers, they're more likely to be highly educated, right, compared to, and to be in skilled occupations. Okay, so just based on this, it seems that, women are less able to fit the model, but what are the consequences? So here, what this figure plots is gender gaps in poverty, in poverty rates. So kind of go a little bit slowly. So the first graph here, right, shows women versus men. Yeah, so simple, women versus men. So here's just the unitary approach, which is just using the usual household equivalized income and computing poverty that way. And you can see that if you use this, there's virtually no gender difference. There is a little bit, yeah. I think maybe about 2 percentage points, but it's very little. Yeah. And once you go to an individual perspective, this gap magnifies massively, right? So our main scenario, this one here in the middle called EQ, gives you about, I think, about 16, 17 points, difference. And then the other two are on either side, as you would expect. Okay, so this is just men versus women. Now, what if you look at men versus women who are reference workers? So this is only men and only women who satisfy our 3 conditions to be a reference worker, right? Interestingly, if you use the unitary approach, actually you find that men are more likely to be poor in this group, right? Male reference workers are more likely to be poor. The difference is small. And then if you use our individual approach, the numbers turn positive, but they're relatively small. They're about 3 percentage points, in our main scenario. Okay, so even among women who fit this model, you still find a slightly higher poverty risk, but admittedly the differences are small, or at least small when you compare with the rest, right? Now, if you look all women versus male reference workers, then you start seeing very large differences, So in the unitary approach, you would have maybe like 7 or 8 percentage points different, but when you go to the individual approach, it's about, about 27 or something like that, So much higher once you go to this individual perspective. And then to kind of think, okay, but what about men? Obviously, men that, as a whole versus male reference workers, they're still, they're more likely to be poor, as you would expect, but the differences are somewhat more muted. Okay, so this is the gender gaps. And now, what is the role of labor market characteristics? So which characteristics of women? Is it the fact that they work fewer hours? Is it the fact that they have a more disrupted career? What is it that really increases their poverty rates? So that's what we're trying to look at here. So here, just to make the figure easy to read, we just show results from our main scenario where we split common benefits equally. So here in the first graph, you see the importance of the economic status. So everything here is in all these gaps that I'm showing here. There are females, yeah, so women versus male reference workers, yeah. So you can see even employed women, yeah, they have a higher poverty risk, about 12 percentage points. But when you move it up to other statuses, well, unemployment and inactive, perhaps we're not surprised. But if we look at self-employment, for example, there's about a 40 percentage point gap, which is quite massive. Yeah. Then if we just focus on the employed women and look by, say, working hours. So we have three categories here. We call marginal part-time, which is part-time work of less than 20 hours per week. Substantial part-time, which we term to be between 20 and 34, and then full-time, which is 35 plus. Yeah, and you can see that even for full-time women, there is an increased poverty risk. But if you look, which is not that small actually. It's about 7 percentage points. But then when you compare that with the part-time categories, the difference is quite massive. So for those in marginal employment, you can see a gap of around 55 points, and then for those in substantial part-time employment, gap around 22 points. And then, for these last two graphs here, the first one is by work experience, yeah, and the last one by skill level. And it's, it's the pattern that you would expect. So women who have had a stronger labor force attachment, they are, their risk is somewhat lower compared to those who have been less attached. And high-skilled women have a lower risk than low-skilled women, as you would expect. But just looking at this graph, you can see that the main thing that comes out is that self-employment is hugely a factor increasing your risk of poverty, and part-time employment the same. Yeah. And if you're wondering, well, what if I would vary my assumption? Well, there's not much difference. Yeah, so here, let me just explain the graph on the left, because the other one is exactly the same. So here we just have the employment statuses, but also using the unitary approach and the two sensitivity scenarios, the primary earner and the secondary earner, right? And you can see that using the unitary approach, everything is much smaller, which is the first dot. And when you take a more individualized approach, these numbers go up massively, right? But it doesn't matter that much whether you assign to the primary earner or the secondary earner or so on. Those things are less consequential. Okay, so finally, let me get to the last bit of our analysis, which was to look at the impact of taxes and benefits. And the way we have tried to do this is, yes, it's a bit standard in the literature, is to try and calculate poverty risks using different income concepts, right? So first you take just market incomes and you calculate the poverty risk. And then you take disposable income and calculate poverty risk, and you look at the difference, and that you attribute that difference to the tax benefit system, right? And you can do something similar and to just isolate the effect of taxes on the one hand and the effect of benefits on the other. Yeah. And this is what we have done again. We have calculated what we call this reference worker poverty gap, yeah, RWPG. And we've calculated that using gross market income and disposable income, right? And then with the intermediary income coefficient. And we've done that for various groups. And what you can see, for example, some interesting findings. By the way, here's a typo. It should be 44.4. I just noticed on the train this morning. Sorry about that. Okay, so what you notice here, so this is the reduction here, this column here is the reduction in the overall the overall tax benefit system. Yeah, so how much do taxes and benefits bring the poverty risk of various women closer to the male reference worker group? Yeah, so you see that there's big effect for inactive and unemployed, but there's actually a small negative effect for the self-employed. So actually, taxes and benefits don't seem to help self-employed women at all. Actually, they seem to make the matters slightly worse, right? And that's because of the tax system in principle. And then if you look at working hours, you can see that there is some reduction of the gap, especially for women working marginal employment and perhaps to a lesser extent women working full-time. And interestingly, though, what you can observe here, so here's we would expect this to be negative, which it is, so it's reducing poverty gaps. But for taxes, we don't observe that. And this is not because taxes reduce income, because remember, this is just the relative difference to the reference male workers, right? So you would expect if reference workers earn more, they also pay more tax. So you should expect these taxes here to be, reducing inequality, not increasing it. And this, in fact, this is probably something we should be looking at more closely, because it's in contradiction to the finding of our first paper, where we found that actually, on average, for the average worker, taxes were an important way an important instrument that reduced inequality between men and women. But remember, here we're looking at the bottom of the distribution. Yeah, so it's a different group. Okay, and then if you look by work experience and by skill level, you find there are not that many differences. Yeah, you see the reduction here doesn't really change much. And yeah, here as well, similar. And the same pattern where, taxes seem to be disequalizing at the bottom of the distribution. Overall, taxes and benefits reduce the poverty gap with respect to male reference workers by about 4.2 percentage points. Out of which, benefits do about 7.1 reduction, and taxes increase it back up by about 2.7 percentage points. Okay, so let me sum up then. So I've tried to persuade you today that we need an individual income concept to look at gender income inequality. And we have motivated this starting from the activation framework and looking to the extent with which women are able to fit this adult worker model, and what are the labor market characteristics that penalize women most, and whether taxes and benefits have an impact or not. So what we found is that women's life courses fit this model less well. Perhaps that's not surprising. Yeah, we find that they are at higher risk of poverty due to, on the one hand, inactivity and unemployment, but also atypical work such as self-employment and part-time work. And this poverty risk is seriously underestimated if you assume full sharing, right? And then moving on to the tax benefit system, we see that overall the system reduces the gap with respect to male reference workers by about 4 percentage points. And that the largest effects are for inactive and unemployed women, whereas for women who find themselves in a typical or part-time employment, the effects are much weaker or perhaps not present at all. And finally, we find that taxes and social insurance contributions seem to be disequalizing at the bottom of the distribution, unlike in our earlier paper. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. Should we start